Hi. The other day I released a video called Sigmund Freud 1950 Lecture on Repression. And on this audio, it's simply about 35 minutes long, and it's the 12 or 13 page long lecture which he gave in Vienna in 1915, which is a very famous paper where he outlines his theory of repression of the unconscious mind. And that's the other video is completely unabridged. This video is kind of like study notes, so it's the same reading as before, but this time I keep stopping and outlining it. The previous video is ideal for anybody who just wants to hear the Freud's lecture, and this is ideal for anybody who'd like to understand Freud's lecture, because without explanation, unless you're very well briefed on Freud in the first place, a lot of it won't make sense to you. And one of the great things we get with this, when we read Freud's works or listen to the lectures, especially if we do it in detail, is the subtlety of what he said. Because back then, the way people described things were not so, like today we'd use pure logic and everything's a list of points and PowerPoint presentations. Back then, they would give lengthy explanations, and in a way, it's a sloppier way of presenting yourself. But in another way, it gives a lot of subtlety because each sentence can be deconstructed. So let's dig in. Sigmund Freud, Repression. One of the vicissitudes an instinctual impulse may undergo is to meet with resistance which seek to make it inoperative. Under certain conditions, which we shall presently investigate more closely, the impulse then passes into the state of repression. Verdrangung, Verdrangung. If what was in question was the operation of an external stimulus, the appropriate method to adopt would obviously be flight. With an instinct, flight is of no avail, for the ego cannot escape from itself. At some later period, rejection based on judgment, condemnation, will be found to be a good method to adopt against an instinctual impulse. Repression is a preliminary stage of condemnation, something between flight and condemnation. It is a concept which could not have been formulated before the time of psychoanalytic studies. Now, what's interesting here is Freud is basically talking about fight and flight. We all pretty much know about this idea of fight or flight, which is basically the instinctual idea that either I have to fight or I have to run away. And interesting enough, I did a little Google on this, and the first person to mention fight or flight is the American physiologist Walter Bradford Cannon, who wrote about the fight or flight response in 1915 in his book Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage. Cannon was a physiologist at Harvard Medical School in the early 1900s. He also coined the term fight or flight response in 1929. So I'm curious to know whether Freud independently came up with this, or maybe he had read this book, because this lecture was also in 1915. So it's very interesting. What he's basically saying here is that why is it that we repress? And he's basically saying, well, we can't run away, because you can't, you can run away from an animal in the forest, but you can't run away from your own self, your own psyche. And that we're repressing because of the beginning of condemnation. So condemnation is judgment. We're judging ourselves and think, I better repress that thought. What kind of thoughts do we tend to repress? Usually, by and large, aggressive and sexual thoughts, and sometimes inappropriate. What I mean by aggressive would be, obviously, I want to hurt somebody. I shouldn't let the people know I want to hurt them, or that maybe I find violence exciting in some way. For example, some person might have a strong sexual fantasy regarding some aspect of violence. You're probably not going to tell anybody that, or not many people. So aggression, you want to punch your boss in the face, for example. You want to punch your neighbor in the head. You don't really say that to many people. And of course, sexual thoughts. You're talking to somebody you find attractive. You're going to blurt it out. You meet some you're at the local um, supermarket, and the person serving you is you're finding them very sexually excited and going to blurt out, "Hey, I think you're hot." Well, some people do, but rarely. It's kind of just seen as not so good. So aggression, sexuality, and the third major one which I would see would be, weird thoughts. Maybe some funny ideas. Again, we might think I shouldn't say this because people will judge me for my funny ideas, which could be maybe very good ideas, but something unusual in the way you're thinking about things. So either way, he's basically saying that repression is the beginning of condemnation. So let's move on to the second paragraph. It is not easy in theory to deduce the possibility of such a thing as repression. Why should an instinctual impulse undergo a vicissitude like this? Vicissitude means variation. A necessary condition of its happening must clearly be that the instinct's attainment of its aim should produce unpleasure instead of pleasure. But we cannot well imagine such a contingency. There are no such instincts satisfaction of an instant. There are no such instincts. Satisfaction of an instinct is always pleasurable. We should have to assume certain peculiar circumstances, some sort of process by which the pleasure of satisfaction is changed into unpleasure. So he's getting back to the idea here, but instincts basically are pleasurable. Punching somebody in the head is pleasurable. Chasing after somebody sexually is pleasurable. Blurting out your inner thoughts about things is pleasurable. So why is it when all these things give us pleasure that we repress them? And now what I mean by repress is, on a normal level, I'm used to using this analogy that I might find somebody sexually attractive, I don't tell them. I might feel like hurting somebody, but I won't tell them. I might have some funny ideas about life, won't tell anybody. That's a conscious choice. But in the case of repression it doesn't even get there. It's just in the unconscious mind. I don't even know that I find that person attractive, or that I want to hit somebody, or to have some funny thought. It's largely repressed. Why would something which is so relieving be repressed? So that's the second paragraph. Let's move on to the third paragraph. In order to better to delimit repression, that means to lower it down, let us discuss some other instinctual situations. He's trying to give some context here. It may happen that an external stimulus becomes internalized. For example, by eating into and destroying some bodily organ, so that if a new source of constant excitation and increased attention rises, the stimulus thereby acquires a far-reaching similarity to an instinct. We know a case of this sort is experienced by us as pain. The aim of this pseudo-instinct, however, is simply the cessation of the change in the organ and the unpleasure accompanying it. There is no other direct pleasure to be attained by cessation of pain. Further, pain is imperative. The only thing to which it can yield to is a removal by some toxic agent or the influence of mental distraction. So when we think of pain, actually, the pleasure in pain is the relief of pain. There is a relief in that tension. There's a tension with pain and a relief when you let it go. So let's move on. He says here, the case of pain is too obscure to give us any help in our purpose. Let us take the case in which an instinctual stimulus, such as hunger, remains unsatisfied. It then becomes imperative and can be allayed by nothing but the action that satisfies it. It keeps up a constant tension of need. Nothing in the nature of repression seems in this case to come remotely into question. Thus repression certainly does not arise in cases where the tension produced by lack of satisfaction of an instinctual impulse is raised to an unbearable degree. The methods of defense which are open to the organism against the situation must be discussed in another connection. So what he's saying here is obviously that hunger creates attention, but it's not repressed. It's very much out there. Let us rather confine ourselves to clinical experience as we meet with it in psychoanalytic practice. So what he's saying is, let's take a look at the psychological situations rather than the physiological ones. We then learn that the satisfaction of an instinct which is under repression will be quite possible, and further that in every instance such a satisfaction will be pleasurable in itself, but it will be irreconcilable with other claims and intentions. It would therefore cause pleasure in one place and unpleasure in another. It has consequently become a condition for repression that the motive of the unpleasure shall have acquired more strength than the pleasure obtained from the satisfaction. Psychoanalytic observation of the transferent neuroses, moreover, leads us to conclude that repression is not a defensive mechanism which is present from the very beginning, and that it cannot arise until a sharp cleavage has occurred between conscious and unconscious mental activity. That the essence of repression lies simply in turning something away and keeping it at a distance from the conscious. This view of repression will be made more complex by assuming that before the mental organization reaches this stage, the task of fending off instinctual impulses is dealt with by the other vicissitudes which instincts may undergo. Example, reversal into the opposite, or turning around upon the subject's own self. So there's a lot to unpack here, so let's take a look at it. So what he's saying here is that while an instinct finds pleasure in its release, as it were, in its fulfillment, in the case of repression, it's creating fulfillment in one place, and it's creating the opposite in another place. So it's a case of the displeasure of the condemnation is higher than the pleasure of the release. So, for example, very practical example in daily life, and again, this is not repression, but it's an example of the mind at work. A person might be married, for example, and find another person very attractive and be very interested, maybe cheating on their wife or husband, but their judgment of feeling that they're a bad person for doing this might be so strong that they're not doing it. But if you think of it this way, somebody who cheats on their partner would, although they might feel guilty about it, they will tend to have more pleasure and excitement than fear or regret. If the person has more fear or regret, it will overcome the pleasure. If the person's pleasure or anticipation of an affair is stronger than their fear or sense of sadness of letting the other side down, then it goes the opposite way. So basically the same thing he's saying on a. Now, you've got to remember, repression is an actual thing that you're not aware of what's happening in consciously. Or I'm giving you a conscious example that you might want to do something but choose not to. Another example might be you're in an office somewhere, there's money lying there at the table, you'd be tempted to take it, and then you think, ooh, what would happen if I took it? So I better not. Okay. But this happens at a subconscious level or unconscious level, that the mind judges something that, oh, I'd like that pleasure, but I can't have it for whatever reason. Okay. He says here that psychoanalytic observation of the transfer neurosis moreover leads us to conclude that the repression is not a defense mechanism. So it's not a defense mechanism, it's separate from that, which is present from the very beginning. So it's not something from the very beginning, as the defense mechanisms are there from the very beginning. In psychoanalytic theory, defense mechanisms are unconscious psychological processes that protect people from anxiety-producing thoughts and feelings. So they're there from the beginning. Repression is an aspect of it, but as he says here, it's not a defensive mechanism. And there's various defense mechanisms that we can have. Okay, so transference neurosis. Well, transference neurosis is the phenomenon in psychoanalysis where patients' perception of their adults becomes entwined with their childhood fantasies and memories I'm just reading here from, this is Google, they've got their little AIs, this is Google AI. So the patient's projection of their feelings about important people in their lives into the analyst, the patient's internal conflicts between their wishes and defenses they form against them, the patient's desire for an external object being transferred to fantasies that take the place of real sexual gratification. So basically, transference neurosis, where you're transferring some attachments to your childhood onto the analyst. So psychoanalytic observation of the transference neurosis, that's the things that the patient transfers onto the analyst, leads us to conclude that repression is not a defensive mechanism. It's proactive, basically. It's not just defensive, which is present from the very beginning, and that it cannot arise until a sharp cleavage has occurred between conscious and unconscious mental activity. So in other words, you cannot have repression unless there's a big gap between the conscious and the unconscious. Now you've got to remember, although I'm quoting examples of conscious decisions that we make, that's only by way of analogy. In the case of repression, you're not consciously aware of this, okay? And then we have here in kind of highlighted line here, that the essence of repression lies simply in turning something away and keeping at a distance from the conscious. So it's like an analogy from life, like in a movie or something like that, or TV show, whereby there's a character and you don't want the other person to see that character. So they're embarrassing, or there's maybe that one person would be angry with the other person, or maybe that person, say, a very attractive person, and you'd be worried that your lover, for example, will see them and be intimidated, or put two and two together and make five and say, oh, you're having an affair with the person. It could be many, many things. We see it in TV, movies, and of course in real life, whereby we try to maybe avoid somebody from seeing somebody else. So in this case, the unconscious mind is trying to avoid the conscious mind from seeing what it is. So with repression, it is the process is exactly as I said, that the avoidance is something. But in this case because it's unpleasurable, because unpleasure is higher than the pleasure. But in this case, it's actually hiding it away from the conscious mind. So again, to repeat that, the essence of repression lies simply in turning something away and keeping it at a distance from the conscious. This view of repression will be made more complete by assuming that before the mental organization reaches the stage, the task of fending off instinctual impulses is dealt with by the other vicissitudes which instincts may undergo. Example, reversal into the opposite, or turning around upon the subject's own self. So what he's basically saying here is, before you get to repression, you've probably already, your mind has tried the other defense techniques. So again, just repeat that. It says here, before the mental organization reaches the stage of repression, the task of fending off instinctual impulses is dealt with by the other vicissitudes, such as reversal to the opposite. So again, I'm quoting from the Google AI here. It says here, in psychoanalysis, a defense mechanism whereby an instinctual aim changes into its opposite, usually from an active passive form. So it gives the example there, for example, of a sadist becoming a masochist. And it's a well-known thing that many people in the sadomasochistic subculture, they'll be the sadist this time, and next time they're the masochist. So it's like an opposite. It's you actually want to hurt somebody, but instead you let yourself be hurt. So, and that's turning the aggression on oneself. And masochism, sadism is an aggression outward, and masochism is an aggression inward. So he's basically saying that before you repress, you probably, at some level, try to avert these things already. But what's happening is, obviously, they're not working, and that's where repression has to come in. And what the question that Freud is driving here is, why? Why are we repressing? How could it be that unpleasurable that you literally just overcome an instinct? And that's an interesting question. It seems to us now that, in view of the very great extent to which repression and what is unconscious are correlated, we must defer probing more deeply into the nature of repression Until we have learned about the structure of the succession of psychical agencies and about the differentiation between what is unconscious and conscious. See the following paper 183 FF. Till then, all we can do is to put together in a purely descriptive fashion a few characteristics of repression that have been observed clinically, even though we run the risk of having to repeat and change much that has been said elsewhere. So basically, he's just saying we need to go deeper into repression, but now he's just going to talk about some general points before he talks about the structure of the conscious and unconscious mind. Here we go. We have reason to assume that there is a primal repression, a first phase of repression, which consists in the psychical, ideational representation of the instinct, being denied entrance into the conscious. So somehow at a very simple level, the instinct has not been allowed. So this is like a bouncer on the door of a bar. They won't let the ruffian in, okay? With this, a fixation is established. The representation in question persists unaltered from then onwards, and the instinct remains attached to it. This is due to the properties of the unconscious processes of which we shall speak later on page 191. So when Freud speaks about fixation, he's talking about a concept which he introduced in 1905. And basically, it's an obsessive drive that can involve an object, concept, or person. So what he's saying here is that once we repress the primordial instinct, it fixates at some level. And so either anal, phallic, or oral, I think. The second stage of repression, so this is at a very basic level, we get fixated at the oral, anal, and phallic stage. The second stage of repression proper, affects mental derivatives of the repressed representative, or such trains of thought as originating elsewhere have come into associative connection with it. On account of this association, these ideas experience the same fate as what was primarily repressed. Repression proper, therefore, is actually an after pressure. So if we go back to the editor's note, he's talking about that repression is a result of anxiety, but later he would say anxiety is a result of repression. So that's his initial thoughts on it. He has here point 3 or note 3. Nachdrangen, Nachdrangen. Freud used the same term in his account of the process in the Schreber analysis, see footnote, and also in his paper on the unconscious, see below. But on alluding to the point more than 20 years later in the third section of Analysis, Terminable and Interminable, 1937, he used the word Nachverdrängung, after repression. So I think he has a change of an idea regarding anxiety. So maybe early on he was thinking that anxiety will result in repression. Later he was thinking anxiety was a result of repression. And like many things, it's a chicken and egg situation. Moreover, it is a mistake to emphasize only the repulsion which operates in the direction of the conscious upon what is to be repressed. Quite important is the attraction exercised by what was primarily repressed upon everything which it can establish a connection. Probably the trend toward repression would fail in its purpose if these two forces did not cooperate. If there were not something previously repressed ready to receive what is repelled by the conscious mind. So Freud is basically saying here we have a situation where we're repelling from the conscious mind the thought, but also it's got an attraction to some aspect of oneself which is waiting for it, which it says here, if there were not something previously repressed ready to receive what is repelled by the conscious mind. So I think one could allude perhaps that at a very early age, thought complexes develop which result in deeply repressed thoughts. And when we're repressing something new, it will join one of those thoughts. It's something to think about. We also have a note here. This account of the two stages of repression given in the last two paragraphs had been anticipated by Freud 4 years earlier, though in somewhat different form, in the third section of the Schreiber analysis 1911, and in a letter to Ferenczi on the 6th December 1910. See also footnote 1914, the interpretation of dreams. So he's talking about a primordial repression, the first phase of repression, and then a second stage of repression, whereas basically by associative thought. So the first phase of repression is a primal repression, first phase of repression. So this is the idea, and it then fixates, and then developing in that team, you get repression proper, whereby the repressed representative or such trains a thought originating somewhere have come into associative connection with it. So it's a development of that. Okay, under the influence of the study of psychoneuroses, which brings to force the important effects of repression, we are inclined to overvalue their psychological bearing and to forget too readily that repression does not hinder the instinctual representative from continuing to exist in the unconscious, from organizing itself further, putting out derivatives and establishing connections. Repression, in fact, interferes only with the relation of the instinctual representation to one psychical system, namely to that of the conscious mind. So he's basically saying this, that repression does not hold back the instinct, but simply prevents it from gaining access to the conscious mind. Psychoanalysis is able to show us other things as well, which are important for understanding the effects of repression in the psychoneuroses. It shows us, for instance, that the instinctual representative develops with less interference and more profusely if it is withdrawn by repression from conscious influence. It proliferates in the dark, as it were, and takes on extreme forms of expression, which, when they are translated and presented to the neurotic, are not only bound to them as alien to themselves, but frighten him by giving him the picture of an extraordinary and dangerous strength of instinct. The deceptive strength of the instinct is a result of an uninhibited development in fantasy, of the damming up consequent on frustrated satisfaction. The fact that this last result is bound up with repression points the direction in which the true significance of repression has to be looked for. So again, he's talking about repression as withdrawn from conscious influence, and that it creates very powerful fantasies, and when a person faces them, it's quite terrifying. So I think a very important thing we have to understand with repression is that the mind is not repressing things just for the hell of it, some kind of way of dealing with memories, or there's just too much stimulation. No, that which is repressed tends to be terrifying for the conscious mind. So the conscious mind usually is repressing something either violent or sexual, or violent and sexual. And it's so disruptive that the conscious mind cannot deal with it. What we also have to remember here, and this is not outlined in this paper so far, but it's a general thing noticed in psychoanalysis, is that when a person is repressed, and pretty much everybody is repressed to some degree, it dampens down the feeling. So the repression works both to protect the mind from anxiety, and also then we can look at, does repression actually cause anxiety? But to protect the mind in some way, but also it dampens down the feelings. So when we come close to that which we are repressing, it is like it's from somebody else. It's like it's not from us. And also because we are neurotic and therefore we're used to dimmed down feelings, the intensity and rawness of these feelings comes as something as a shock to our system and is incomprehensible. And this is the whole key. The repression is protecting us on some level, And if you come across that which you're repressing, to some degree, it's incapable, or we are not capable of really fully engaging in it. It's too shocking to us in some way or other, because we're repressing because we cannot face up to whatever it is that we're repressing in the first place.
Reverting once more, however, to the opposite aspect of repression, let us make it clear that it is not even correct to suppose that repression withholds from the unconscious all the derivatives of what was primarily repressed. Point 1. What follows in this paragraph is discussed at greater length in section 6 of the unconscious. If these derivatives have become sufficiently far removed from the repressed representative, whether owing to the adoption of distortions or by reason of the number of intermediate links inserted, they have free access to the conscious. It is as though the resistance of the conscious against them was a function of their distance from what was originally repressed. In carrying out the technique of psychoanalysis, we continually require the patient to produce such derivatives of the repressed as in consequence either of their remoteness or of their distortion can pass the censorship of the conscious. Indeed, the associations which require him to give without being influenced by any conscious purportive idea, without any criticism, and from which we can reconstitute a conscious translation of the repressed representative. These associations are nothing else than remote and distortive derivatives of this kind. During this process, we observe that the patient can go on spinning a thread of such associations till he is brought up against some thought, the relation of which to what is repressed becomes so obvious that he is compelled to repeat his attempt at repression. Neurotic symptoms, too, must have fulfilled the same condition, for they are derivatives of the repressed, which has, by their means, finally won the access to the conscious which was previously denied it. Point number 2. In the German editions from 1924, the latter part of the sentence read, he has German here, I'm not going to repeat the German. This was translated formally, which has finally wrestled from the consciousness the right of way previously denied it. In the German editions from 24 onwards, the word vom was corrected to zum, thus altering the sense of the given text above. So what he's basically saying here is that the repressed thought is always trying to find a way forward, and that it can be sometimes so obvious of what it's trying to do that the mind has to keep re-repressing what's actually happening. I think an analogy would make this easier to understand. Just think in terms of, for example, in, say, television or radio or even movie censorship. There's a tendency of you want to do something, but it's censored. So how are you going to get around it? So say, for example, a movie. You want the movie to be, say, PG, general, okay? So you can't have any blood in it. So you basically have maybe a character killing many people, but there's shots going off where no blood. Everybody knows what's going on, but you're kind of covering up. It's very obvious what the movie's trying to do, but you don't see the splatter. And therefore it doesn't get this R rating, or maybe a lot of splatter, in which case again, X rating. So, same thing. I give you a very simple example we'd have now, presently. It's now 2023, November, that I'm recording this. We recently had an outbreak of a certain virus, and people, because they were on, say, on YouTube, for example, if you mention the name of this thing, you basically get kicked off. Even if you were pro or anti or any angle you took, you tended to be censored in some way. So people would just start using, they never use the actual word. And I'm not using the actual word either, because I don't want to have any problem with my video. So that's an example of, you all know what I'm talking about. There's a certain thing that happened around the year 2020 or so that caused a lot of problems for a lot of people, a certain virus, but I'm not mentioning the name. So I'm getting past the censor because I'm not using the name, but it's very obvious what I'm talking about. And this is the exact same problem we have. So basically, the censorship process of the unconscious mind is very clunky. And another interesting thing is, if we think about how the unconscious mind works, it's basically, I think, quite close to an embedded device. So, like an electronic device that we have, say, in our car, that you switch on your car, the air conditioning might come on straight away, for example. Or you boot up your device and certain apps and so on will pop up. So it's like that. There's no mind behind it. So it's quite clunky. Let's continue. So the bottom of page 149 of this book, heading to page 150, we can lay down no general rule as to what degree of distortion and remoteness is necessary before the resistance on part of the conscious is removed. A delicate balancing is here taking place, the play of which is hidden from us. Its mode of operation, however, enables us to infer that it is a question of calling a halt when the catexis of the unconscious reaches a certain intensity, an intensity beyond which the unconscious would break through to satisfaction. Repression acts, therefore, in a highly individual manner. Each single derivative of the repressed may have its own special vicissitude. A little more or a little less distortion alters the whole outcome. In this connection, we can understand how it is that the objects to which men give most preference, their ideals, proceed from the same perceptions and experiences as the objects which they most abhor, and that they are originally only distinguished from one another through slight modifications. Indeed, as we found in tracing the origins of the fetish, it is possible for the original instinctual representative to be split in two, one part undergoing repression, while the remainder, precisely on account of the intimate connection, undergoes idealization. So what he's basically saying here is that repression acts in a very individual way. That's going to be the vicissitude, so a very different way from one person to another. And he talks then about the objects, so the objects of desire. So basically that we have objects. So if you take fetish, for example, he would say, for example, that maybe a young boy, he keeps seeing his mother wearing certain high heels or boots, for example, and then he starts to idealize the boot. So because he has a sexual attraction to the mother, and she keeps wearing boots. So maybe that's a fairly rough example, but basically things like fetishism is developed very early in life, and perhaps why, the appeal of, say, lingerie or boots and so on, at least in certain cases, might be either that young boys have seen it on movies and TV, or that they've seen it in person. They've seen maybe their mom or their sister or somebody, or some relative who they love at some level, and maybe have libidinous thoughts towards on some level, wearing such outfits. It's a possibility, at least. Either way, fetishism seems to come early in life. So what we have to remember here is that when Freud is doing this, and psychoanalysts are doing it in general, psychoanalysis and all psychotherapy is basically, I would like to suggest, a bit more like a philosophy than a psychology, because although it's psychology, it's based on observation and basically using your head and coming up with common sense deductions. We can't prove any of this is true, but if you were to work as a psychoanalyst or a psychotherapist and you would keep meeting people, you'd find that a lot of this stuff is pretty repetitive, and it seems that people do pick up fetishes early in life, and that what one person's way of coping with life is different than somebody else's, and that people do repress in different ways. So these are anecdotally observed. Can we connect the observation objectively to the deductive reasoning used here? We can't totally connect it. There's no way of being 100% sure that the outcome and the deduction are the same thing. We're not 100% sure. But certainly anecdotally, this was strongly observed by Freud. And of course, he could be just, people see what they want to see. That's also true. So we can't say it's totally objective. But certainly anecdotally, he found it to be the case. And a very interesting concept here is that the idea can be split in two. So on one level, it can be repressed, and so it becomes something you can't deal with. and another level it can undergo idealization. And this is why when you look at people and their sexual orientation and the way they express themselves sexually is often very quirky and very odd, and people do a lot of funny things regarding sexuality. And so it's a very interesting thing how you can have an idealization of certain things, and some of it's pretty funny. I remember hearing before of apparently this is a thing, although I've never personally heard of it, but I've come across it in literature and so on. Some men, for example, robbing women's underwear for clotheslines, and that's their thing. I mean, that's just weird, okay? But there you go. So, idealization. So if you think about fetishization, is always an idealization of something that on its own is mundane, like, for example, a desire for, boots or leather or whatever. It's all rather silly, but from the person's point of view, it feels very enjoyable. So why is it enjoyable? It's enjoyable because in the moment of involving themselves in that fetishization, they get a relief from repression, and that's very enjoyable. That's basically how it works. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph. The same result as follows from an increase or decrease in the degree of the distortion may also be achieved at the other end of the apparatus, so to speak, by a modification in the conditions for the production of pleasure and unpleasure. Special techniques have been evolved with the purpose of bridging about such changes in the play of mental forces that what would otherwise give rise to unpleasure may on this occasion result in pleasure. And whenever a technical device of this sort comes into operation, the repression of an instinctual representative which would otherwise be repudiated is lifted. These techniques have till now only been studied in any detail in jokes. As a rule, the repression is only temporarily lifted and is promptly reinstated. And point number 2 he has here, second chapter of Freud's book in jokes. So I think what Freud is kind of going around the circles with here, he's basically saying that he mentioned the apparatus. So, Freud, I think I've already mentioned this. There was a book called Freud, the Biologist of the Mind, and it was basically the person's focus on the biography was that he was basically into biology. And basically, Freud was a neurologist, and he wanted to be an academic, but it wasn't going to work out because at the time there was so much anti-Semitism in Austrian medical organizations and the colleges and so on, that he just wouldn't get a professorship. So he went into private practice. So he tended to think in terms of engineering terms, like there's a structure in the subconscious mind, and of course that will have a physical correlation to things like neurosynapses and so on. Because you've got to remember, Freud was basically a neurologist. That's what he was first. Okay, so I think what he's really talking about here is technical advice. We're really talking, as far as I can see, what he's talking about here is sadomasochism, that one can find pleasure in pain. Okay, so he says that the purpose is bringing about changes in the play of mental forces that would otherwise give rise to unpleasure, may in this occasion result in pleasure. And the reason why is that it's lifting up repression. So the thing is, repression keeps us in place in society, but it also dulls us down. And so we have a dull, we're not feeling fully, okay? So fetishes, so in this example, I think is what he indicates, say sadomasochism, is the pain of masochism can, for a person who's inclined that way, result in the lifting of repression. And of course, for the sadist, that can also result in that. And apparently, I don't have personal experience, but apparently, in many cases, the sadist and the masochist switch places. So it's obviously sadomasochism, as in the person who's a sadist is often a masochist, and often the person masochist is a sadist. This is often the case, but not always the case. And then he says that basically he's covered this in jokes. And the basic thing in jokes is that the slipping and sliding of the metaphorical meanings release the tension. Okay, so repression is basically because we have somewhere along the way in the early life, in the young childhood, come to the conclusion that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and therefore we cannot deal with them. Otherwise, we lose our mental integrity and the mind will deconstruct, which is basically go mad. And so we have to repress. But then there's ways of lifting the repression, and fetishes and so on are one way of releasing it. Observations like this, however, enable us to note more further characterizations of repression. Not only is it, as we have just shown, individual in its operation, but it is also exceedingly mobile, so it can keep changing. The process of repression is not to be regarded as an event which takes place once, the results of which are permanent, as when some living thing has been killed, and from that time onwards is dead. Repression demands a persistent expenditure of force, and if this were to cease, the success of the repression would be jeopardized, so that a fresh act of repression would be necessary. We may suppose that the repression exercised a continuous pressure in the direction of the conscious, so that this pressure must be balanced by an increasing counter-pressure. Thus, the maintenance of a repression involves an uninterrupted expenditure of force, while its removal results in a saving from the economic point of view. The mobility of repression, incidentally, also finds expression in the psychocharacteristics of the state of sleep, which alone renders possible the formation of dreams. With a return to waking life, the repressive catexes which have been drawn in are more sent out. And we also have point 2 here. So he says here, it renders the possible formation of dreams. The line is the mobility repression, incidentally, also finds expression in the psychical representation of state of sleep, which alone renders possible the formation of dreams. Point number 2, the interpretation of dreams. So what is he at here? Okay. So he's basically saying is that repression is not something fair. So again, just think of it this way. Imagine you're in a police state, for example, a country whereby you can't do this and you can't do that. It's not like they can just have a rule and say never do this. So instead you always have the secret police roaming around the place, continually making sure that people obey and people fit in. So repression is like that. You have to keep on working at the repression. And that there's a lot of pressure. And he talks about economics. So basically, the repression, which is saving you from that thought which you cannot deal with because otherwise you deconstruct your mind, it actually has a big overhead, a big weight, because you're continually putting pressure. And like I noted earlier, the big aspect of repression is the affect, and the affect is that of losing libido. You lose drive. You live in a duller world, okay? So there's different things that will allow that repression to lift, and we get closer to our instinctual self. So, which is things like a lot of pleasurable activities, and also on the positive side, things like falling in love will be a positive example. Things like maybe becoming very sexual will be more of a rough or gross example. But the key thing here is that there's an effort involved, and there's a continual pressure, and that might cause more and more. And we can also extrapolate that to think in terms that in some cases a person might have a series of thoughts which are repressing, and these thought complexes are requiring so much of an overhead that the person becomes more and more clouded. So think in terms of a computer that has more and more viruses, and I'm sure we've all had a situation at some stage where a device, usually a computer, had a bunch of viruses, and this thing's running slow and that thing's running slow and so on. The same thing with human mind. If a person has a lot of repression going on, their actual capacity, like their intelligence, will be restricted, their creativity. As a rule of thumb for everybody, repression will result of a dulling down of existence. But if there's a lot of mental complexity in a person, a lot of mental complexes, and a lot of different thoughts being repressed at once, there's so much effort to repress them that the person will become very inhibited from themselves. And one of the interesting things of lifting repression is a freeing of creativity. An example of that, of course, can be recreational drugs, particularly of the type of, say, cocaine, for example, which a lot of people have found very creative because it's restricting or it's lifting up that repression and letting the creativity flow. Psychedelics can also have a similar effect. Now, I'm not recommending drugs, I'm just saying it as example. Things like falling in love, having a very powerful sexual activity, maybe very vigorous dancing, or some kind of joyful experience, or maybe climbing a very tough mountain and then the relief of getting to the top. There's so many things which can relieve that pressure, and some of them are very positive. It's not always negative, but that release and improvement in mental state is because you've lifted, at least temporarily, the repression. And he says there, the mobility of repression incidentally also finds expression in psychic characteristics of state of sleep. So in sleep, we're so repressed that we're actually completely out cold, if you just think of it that way. With a return in waking life, the repressive catexes which are being drawn in are once more sent out. So again, you're back dealing with repression again. So I think you get a vibe here that repression is a different complexity of human life. And the theme that runs throughout Freud's work is this idea of metonymy and metaphor. Metonymy is that which is repetitive, boring. Metaphor is that which is deep in understanding and meaningful. As Lacan would talk about, Jacques Lacan, the shifting and sliding of metaphors. And so basically we're seeking a metaphorical life, but repression gets in the way. But we need to be repressed to some degree because we can't be totally primordial. Remember, if we're totally primordial, we're into things like raping and pillaging and beating people up and killing people and stuff, and we can't go to that. So we have to compromise. And this is something that Freud comes across in his Civilizations and Discontents work, that we're basically sacrificing our creativity and our, let's say, our state of mojo, of tremendous libido and freedom of expression, which is there. That instinctual side has to be heavily repressed in order to fit into society. And we need to fit into society just to go along, to get along. Finally, we must not forget that after all we have said, very little about an instinctual impulse when we have established that it is repressed. Without prejudice to its repression, such an impulse may be in wildly different states. It may be inactive, that is, only very slightly catected with psychical energy, or may be catected in varying degrees and so unable to be active. True, its activation will not result in a direct lifting of the repression, but it will set in motion all the processes which end in a penetration by the impulse into consciousness along circuitous paths. With unrepressed derivatives of the unconscious, the fate of a particular idea is often decided by the degree of its activity or catexis. It is an everyday occurrence that such a derivative remains unrepressed so long as it represents only a small amount of energy. Although its content will be calculated to give rise to a conflict with what is dominant in consciousness. The quantitative factor proves decisive for this conflict. As soon as the basically obnoxious idea exceeds a certain degree of strength, the conflict becomes a real one, and it is precisely this activation that leads to repression. So that, where repression is concerned, an increase of energetic catexis operates in the same sense as an approach to the unconscious, while the decrease of that catexis operates in the same sense as remoteness from the unconscious or distortion. We see that the repressive trends may find a substitute for repression in a weakening of what is distasteful. So, what he's basically saying is you can have an idea which you don't like dealing with, and it doesn't result in a lot of repression. It's kind of there in the background somewhere. The technical words that he uses, he says here, it may be inactive, that is only very slightly catected with psychical energy, or maybe be catected in varying degrees and so unable to be active. Okay, so it's a bit like, for example, in a city you might have a troublesome area and they have riot police and stuff, but there's no rioting going on, so they have the barricades and they have the curfew and the riot guys are there ready to rock and roll, but the people are doing their thing and the police are doing their thing. But then when a certain amount of unrest, instead of one or two people shouting something, a whole bunch of people start shouting something. Next thing, the police get their tear gas and their water jets and everything out there, and their full riot gear on. So we have a lot of obnoxious. What he means obnoxious thought doesn't mean it's a bad thought, but a thought that we cannot deal with, that our inner critic cannot accept. And so it will be there, but it's like we know something, but we're not really aware of it. We're not really thinking about it. But then if it becomes a pain, an unbearable thought, our mind will start repressing. In our discussion so far, we have dealt with the repression of an instinctual representative, and by the latter we have understood an idea or group of ideas which is connected with a definite quota of psychical energy, libido or interest, coming from an instinct. Clinical observation now obliges us to divide up what we have hitherto regarded as a single entity, for it shows us that beside the idea, some other element representing the instinct has to be taken into account. And this other element undergoes vicissitudes of repression, which may be quite different from those undergone by the idea. For this other element of the psychorepresentative, the term quota of effect has been generally adopted. It corresponds from the idea and finds expression proportionate to its quantity in processes which are sensed of effects. From this point on, in describing a case of repression, we shall have to follow up separately what, as a result of repression, becomes of the idea and what becomes of the instinctual energy linked to it. So, in this way, Freud is kind of thinking in a kind of engineering mode, like an engineer, because he's thinking in terms of energy of a system. And that, yeah, you have an idea, but there's a certain amount of emotionality attached to that. And you could look at different types of emotions, instinctual versus maybe just general emotive, for example. Like anger will be an instinctual energy, but then something like love will be more of an emotional energy, for example. If somebody suddenly jumps out in front of you, might suddenly be very aggressive. It's an instinctual energy. If somebody upsets you, you might have more of a brooding anger, which is more of an emotional anger. But either way, we're not just ideas or beings that have ideas. We have feelings and emotional, energetic ideas, energy that's connected to those ideas. So he's saying that it's not a single entity, okay? He also talks of psychical energies, libido or interest. And libido is basically the drive. We tend to think libido is sex, but it's also kind of the drive. And interest will be kind of, rather than a drive, one would think in terms of the ego itself as interest. So you might, for example, be interested in becoming an accountant. Well, you couldn't say it's like libido. It's not like an instinctual drive. But it's a distinct interest because you have an interest in being an accountant, or you think there's a good living to be earned being an accountant, and so on. We should be glad to be able to see something general about the vicissitudes of both. And having taken our bearings a little, we shall, in fact, be able to do so. The general vicissitude, which overtakes the idea that represents the instinct, can hardly be anything else than it should vanish from the conscious of it was previously conscious, or that it should be held back from the consciousness of it was about to become conscious. The difference is not important. It amounts to much the same thing as the difference between my ordering an undesirable guest out of my drawing room or out of my front hall, and my refusing after recognizing to let him cross my threshold at all. And he has point number one here. This simile, which is thus applicable to the process of repression, may also be extended to a characteristic of it, which is being mentioned earlier. I have merely to add that I must set a permanent guard over the door, which I have forbidden this guest to enter, since he would otherwise burst it open. See above. The simile has been elaborated by Freud in the second of his 5 lectures in 1910. The quantitative factor of the instinctual representative has 3 possible vicissitudes. In other words, within the energy is three options. As you can see from a cursory survey of the observations made by psychoanalysis, either the instinct is altogether repressed, so no trace of it is found, or it appears an effect which is some way or other qualitatively coloured, or it is changed into anxiety. The 2 latter possibilities set up the risk of taking into account as a further instinctual vicissitude the transformation into effects, and especially into anxiety, of the psychical energies of instincts. So what he's saying here is a person can be so repressed that there's no emotionality at all. Say, for example, some person had died, and that person's family, and they don't know why, but it doesn't seem to bother them at all. What that means is they are fully repressed. Yeah. So that's basically a full repression. A slight repression would be, I'm not as upset as I should be about something. It doesn't seem to bother me so much. That's a slight repression.
And then if it's incapable of dealing with it, if you literally can't deal with it at all. So let's say the death of, say, a family member, well, you might be slightly repressed about it. You might be fully repressed to the degree you don't feel anything. But if there's an awful lot of psychic energy there that you can't deal with, it will just be you just feel generally anxious. And so we all tend to be anxious a lot because of so many things that we just can't really deal with at all. So that's the transformation into effects, especially anxiety. And anxiety is a big thing in psychoanalysis because nobody could ever really define exactly what it is, but it seems to be this thing of psychical energy just lingering around that we've repressed so much, we still got the energy, and what we're going to do with the energy, and then the energy just comes out general as an overall sense of anxiety. We recall the fact that the motive and purpose of repression was nothing else than the avoidance of unpleasure. So all repression is a way to avoid an unpleasurable thought, and of course we know that sometimes avoiding unpleasure causes more problems, and that's why repression, of course, often causes problems because we're not even aware of what we're avoiding. So here we go. We recall that the fact that the motive and purpose of repression was nothing else than the avoidance of unpleasure. It follows that the vicissitude of the quota of effect belonging to the representative is far more important than the vicissitude of the idea, and this fact is decisive for our assessment of the process of repression. If repression does not succeed in preventing feelings of unpleasure or anxiety from arising, we may say that it has failed, even though it may have achieved its purpose as far as the ideational portion is concerned. Repressions that have failed will, of course, have more claim on our interest than any that may have been successful, for the latter will, for the most part, escape our examination. So, say, for example, something painful happened in childhood. I might be so repressed you don't even remember it. It just isn't there. But people who go to the psychoanalyst or psychotherapist, for example, will often have a symptom that doesn't work for them. Like there was one of the cases of Freud, this guy called Wolfman, and only when he defecated he felt real, and then the other time he didn't. So he had very small little periods of feeling anything because he was so mega repressed. So it wasn't helping him. He just full of symptoms. His life was full of symptoms because he couldn't do anything. He couldn't live a normal life. It was very unemotional. So these are examples of repressions that have failed. So repressions that have failed are obviously going to bring you to the psychotherapist or psychoanalyst because you are really suffering a lot and you're messed up. Like you can't get into a plane, for example. You don't know why. You start crying and stuff. So that's a repression that's not working because you should be able to get in the plane to get your destination, not just have a big panic attack. That's a failed repression, as an example. The end of page 153, more or less. Sigmund Freud, Repression, bottom of page 153. We must now try to obtain some insight into the mechanism of the process of repression. In particular, we want to know whether there is a single mechanism only or more than one, and whether perhaps each of the psychoneuroses is distinguished by a mechanism of repression peculiar to it. At the outset of this inquiry, however, we are met by complications. The mechanism of a repression becomes accessible to us only by our deducing that mechanism from the outcome of the repression. Confining our observations to the effect of repression on the ideational proportion of the representative, we discover that, as a rule, it creates a substitutive formation. What is the mechanism of which such a substitute is formed, or should we distinguish several mechanisms here as well? Further, we know that repression leaves symptoms behind it. May we then suppose that the forming of substitutes and the forming of symptoms coincide, and if this is so, the whole is the mechanism of forming symptoms the same as that of repression. The general probability would seem to be that the two are widely different, and that it is not the repression itself which produces substitutive formations and symptoms, but that these are indications of a return of the repressed, and owe their existence to quite other processes. It would also seem advisable to examine the mechanisms by which substitutes and symptoms are formed before considering the mechanism of repression. So, at the early part of this paragraph, he says the mechanism of repression becomes accessible to us only by deducing that mechanism from the outcome. So basically, it's a kind of a bit like being a, private detective or something.
the psychoanalyst has to look at the symptom and say, well, what's causing it? Because the two are not linked. Often the person will have a certain symptom. The usual symptoms you have are things like not feeling, like being blank, for example, or feeling in a very inappropriate way, or not being able to access certain feelings, or not being able to function in daily life. But that's a symptom, and what actually causes it. He then starts talking about substitutive formation and symptoms and what they are. So let's go on and let's see if he clarifies this. Obviously, there is no subject for further speculation. The place of speculation must be taken by a careful analysis of the results of repression, observable in different neuroses. I must therefore suggest that we should postpone this task too until we have formed reliable conceptions of the relations of the conscious to the unconscious. Point number 2. Freud takes up the task in section 4 of his paper, The Unconscious. But in order that the present discussion may be not entirely unfruitful, I will say that in advance. 1. The mechanism of repression does not in fact coincide with the mechanism or mechanisms of forming substitutes. 2. There are a great many different mechanisms of forming substitutes. 3. The mechanisms of repression have at least this one thing in common: a withdrawal of the catexis of energy or of libido. We're dealing with the sexual instincts. So he's outlining here that the mechanism of repression is different from substitutes. There are many different mechanisms for substitutes. And the third point basically is that when repression is there, there's going to be a lack of libido. Now, when he's talking about libido, we tend to think of sex, but it's not just that. It's basically drive, things like proactivity, aggression, passion, and it can, of course, be sex drive, but it's basically reduction in these strong things. That this strong. You got to remember, this is the one I'm reading here. This is James Strachey. So he tends to use libido as sex drive, but it's drives in general, okay? The drive to survive mainly. So further restricting myself to the 3 best known forms of psychoneurosis, I will show by means of some example how the concepts here introduced find application to the study of repression. So he's going to outline it now. For the field of anxiety hysteria, and that was a big deal back those days. We don't see it much these days, but in a repressed Victorian society, this thing of women fainting and stuff was a commonality. For the field of anxiety hysteria, I will choose a well-analyzed example of an animal phobia. The instinctual impulse subjected to repression here is libidinal attitude towards a father coupled with a fear of him. So in other words, the patient has an attraction to her father and a fear of her father. After repression, this impulse vanishes out of consciousness. The father does not appear in it as an object of libido. As a substitute for him, we find a corresponding place, some animal, which is more or less fitted to be an object of anxiety. So instead of getting anxious over her dad, she gets anxious over an animal. The formation of the substitute for the ideational portion of the instinctive representative has come about by displacing along a chain of connections which is determined in a particular way. The quantitative portion has not vanished, but has been transformed into anxiety. The result is a fear of a wolf instead of a demand for love from the father. The categories here implied are, of course, not enough to supply an adequate explanation of even the simplest case of psychoneurosis. There are always other considerations to be taken into place. So he says, basically, you can't fully explain it, but in general, this particular girl, she was very strongly attracted to her father and also very much feared her father, couldn't deal with those thoughts. So instead, from an ideational point of view, it becomes a fear, a thought of, I don't like wolves, I'm scared of wolves. So instead of I'm scared of my father, because she has to deal with her father every day, I'm scared of wolves, because her dad's like a wolf. Okay, so that's the ideational thought. And of course, then the anxiety is the feeling. So she thinks of the wolf, it creates anxiety. So there's a difference between the ideational idea, which is the wolf, and the psychical energy, which is then an anxiety attached to wolves. All of this could be fairly effective. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, you're not going to see a wolf in daily life unless you live in a forest. So it's probably not a bad form or a very ineffective form of repression, because most people are not going to see wolves very often. Okay, A repression such as occurs in an animal phobia must be described as radically unsuccessful. All that it has done is to remove and replace the idea. It has failed altogether in sparing unpleasure. So he sees it as very unsuccessful. It's not going to reduce unpleasure. I'm disagreeing slightly because I'm thinking, well, okay, yeah, you got a fear of, say, sparrows or crows or something, you're going to be tortured. But something like a wolf, how often are you going to see a wolf? But anyway, in general, it's like, say you have a irrational fear of dogs, but there's dogs all over the place, you're going to have a tough time. For this reason, too, the work of the neurosis does not cease. It proceeds to a second phase. So if this didn't work, the neurosis gets worse, okay? Because your mind keeps trying to protect you from unpleasure. It proceeds to a second phase in order to attain its immediate and more important purpose. What follows is an attempt at flight, the formation of the phobia proper. In other words, I see that dog, that's it, I'm just going to run out of here, I can't deal with it, okay? Of a number of avoidances which are intended to prevent the release of anxiety, more specialized investigation enables us to understand the mechanism by which the phobia achieves the same. Of course, the phobia of animals is very ineffective. Like you got phobia of spiders or something. Every time you see a spider, you go bananas. Every time you see a dog, you go bananas. Well, it's going to affect the quality of your life. So in other words, the idea might be I don't like dogs, for example, or I don't like cats. The idea has been shifted from whatever's really causing you anxiety and stress to that. But you see these animals so often that you don't have any. You're still being reminded through this chain of associations in your subconscious mind or unconscious mind, and so you're still being faced with the anxiety which you're trying to avoid. We are obliged to take quite another view of the process of repression when we consider the picture of a true conversion hysteria. Here the salient point is that it's possible to bring about a total disappearance of the quote effects. So in this case, this kind of hysteria, there's no emotionality at all. So it's not just like I think of the wolf and I get scared. It's I think of the wolf and I don't feel anything. When this is so, the patient displays towards his symptoms what Charcot is a famous hypnotist as far as I remember, called La Belle Indifference des Hystériques. I'm killing it in French, I know. I think Charcot is the guy he went to for hypnotherapy training. In other cases, this suppression is not so completely successful. Some distressing sensations may attach to the symptoms themselves, or it may prove impossible to prevent some release of anxiety, which in turn sets to work the mechanism of forming a phobia. The ideational content of the instinctual representative is completely withdrawn from the consciousness as a substitute, and at the same time as a symptom. We have an all-over strong innervation. In typical cases, a somatic one, so it's a physical problem. So he's getting into Charcot's idea of people who can't walk or move an arm. Say, for example, a person was in a job whereby they really hated a job, but they had to type a lot. So instead now they have a problem that they can't move their fingers, that kind of thing. Literally, I don't want to go and type, or I don't want to go and work, I don't want to walk, I want to stand all day, so my legs don't work, for example. Okay, so he says here that the ideation content of the instinctual representative is completely withdrawn from the conscious as substitutive, as a symptom. We have an all-over strong inversion. Okay, so the over-inverted area proves on the closer view to be part of the repressed instinctual representative itself, a part which, as though by a process of condensation, has drawn the whole catexis on itself. So this is obviously terribly ineffective. Things like you don't like a job, maybe where you're standing, so you can't walk anymore. Now it's really affecting your life. So you don't have to stand, but now it's really affecting your life. So the condensation as the catexis goes into the leg just doesn't work at all. These remarks do not, of course, bring to light the whole mechanism of a conversion hysteria, and especially the factor of regression, which will be considered in another connection, has also been taken into account. Insofar as repression in conversion hysteria is made possible only by the extensive formation of substitutes,
it may be judged to be entirely unsuccessful. Yeah, it sure is. If you can't walk because you don't like a security job, or you can't type because you don't like typing, you can't actually use your hands, that is terribly unsuccessful. As regards dealing with the quota of effect, however, which is the true task of repression, it generally signifies a total success. Well, okay, you don't have that horrible feeling you used to have, but you can't use your legs anymore. In conversion hysteria, the process of repression is completed with the formation of the symptom and does not, as in anxiety hysteria, need to be continue to a second phase, or rather, strictly speaking, to continue endlessly. So, a person, for example, who has some fear of an animal, they're basically now, not only have they shifted the thought of that unpleasant person situation to an animal, they now have this thing that if they see the animal, they go into a panic attack, for example. So this is like going to a higher stage to try and repress, because the anxiety is there all the time. They have huge amounts of anxiety. The person who can't use their leg or their arm is no anxiety. They feel they got a physical problem. Say a person, they don't want to see things in their life that are very disturbing, and next thing they go blind. Yeah, you're not seeing anything, and you don't feel any upsetness about it, but you can't see. That's not very effective. It's effective in the sense that you're not dealing with the anxiety, but it causes a secondary problem, which is worse, like not being able to walk or whatever it is. A totally different picture of repression is shown once more in the third disorder, which we shall consider for the purpose of our illustration, in obsessional neurosis. Good old obsessional neurosis, that's what most of us have. Here we are at first in doubt what it is that we have to regard as the instinctual representative that is subjected to repression, whether it is a libidinal or a hostile trend. This uncertainty arises because obsessional neurosis has at its basis a regression owing to which a sadistic trend has been substituted for an affectionate one. It is this hostile impulse against someone who is loved which is subjected to repression. The effect at an early stage of the work of repression is quite different from what's taking place at a later one. At first, the repression is completely successful. The ideational content is rejected and the effect made to disappear. As a substitutive formation, there arises an alteration of the ego in the shape of an increased conscientiousness, and this can hardly be called a symptom. Here, substitute and symptom do not coincide. From this we learn something too about the mechanism of repression. In this instant, as in all others, repression has brought about a withdrawal of libido, but here it has made use of reaction formation for this purpose by intensifying an opposite. Thus, in this case, the formation of a substitute has the same mechanism as repression, and at bottom coincides with it, while chronologically, as well as conceptually, it is distinct from the formation of a symptom. It is very probable that the whole process is made possible by the ambivalent relationship into which the sadistic impulsion that has to be repressed has been introduced. So what he's basically talking about here is that you might have, affection towards somebody, especially usually a family member or somebody in your youth. But there's also a sadistic drive. That's the thing with Freud would kind of say sadism is a very natural thing. That the aggressive drive to hurt somebody is natural. But we find it difficult to deal with. So we might love somebody but want to hurt them in some way. So we have to repress it. And in the case of repression, it reduces libido. And also often the thought is connected with our superego. And so we become very much, sort of person who's very right and wrong, and gets guilty all the time, and you can't do this and can't do that. So let's say, for example, let's say somebody who maybe has a strong, homosexual drive, for example, and they're raised in a very religious way. They might hate gay people, but actually subconsciously, unconsciously, they actually are leaning in that direction, but they cannot stand it. And so they've completely pushed themselves away from that, and they have a disgust of it, okay? So if you're disgusted by somebody in any way at all, this will always be the superego is having an effect, okay? So let's go on. But the repression, which was at first successful, does not hold firm. In the further course of things, its failure becomes increasingly marked. It talks about ambivalence. So ambivalence is that you like but don't like somebody you like but don't like situation. And this is extremely common in a lot of people early in life. They have ambivalent relationships with their parents, for example. They don't know if they like their parents or don't like their parents. And so they go through life having friendships and romantic relationships where they're not sure, I don't know if I like, I don't know if I like the situation, don't like. Ambivalence is very common in a lot of people. The ambivalence which has enabled repression through reaction formation to take place is also the point at which the repression succeeds in returning. The vanished effect comes back in its transformed shape as a social anxiety, moral anxiety, unlimited self-reproaches. The rejected idea is replaced by substitutive of displacement, often a displacement onto something very small or very indifferent. So now you get into the likes of the obsessive compulsive, the person with OCD who's washing their hands 100 times a day. What Freud would suggest is they are getting pleasurable sexual thoughts, but they feel guilty about the pleasure they felt as a child. They felt some pleasurable sexual thoughts, and so they have to wash their hands free of them. They have to, check how many times they close the door, or avoid stepping on, the cracks in the road or something. And it's basically the superego is going bananas, and they're repressing like anything to try and not deal with the anxiety that they feel guilty over feeling these thoughts, which are perfectly natural thoughts, but their superego is so strong. A tendency to a complete re-establishment of the repressed idea is, as a rule, unmistakably present. The failure in the repression of the quantitative affective factor brings into play the same mechanism as flight by means of avoidance and prohibition. So in an effort to avoid the anxiety, the person is now basically superego or inner critic, we could say, on overdrive. I don't like this and don't like that. And you have a person who's very tight and uptight and emotionally repressed but upset all the time, very anxious and so on, because it's not working. They're trying to repress their sexual thoughts or their aggressive thoughts perhaps, and they're trying to be very ideal. We see this with a lot of religious people, people maybe more so years ago when people were very religious. They would be very uptight, less so today I suppose, but yeah, they the sort of person wants to live their life by a rule book, okay, and of course nothing kind of fits, and the anxiety keeps leaking out every time nothing perfect happens. So this is the ideal case of the obsessive neurotic, but I'd also say the over-religious, kind of over-conscientious person who maybe has a lot of negative self-talk and so on, would be another example of somebody who is trying to repress the instinctive side of their personality and is failing. So he says, by means of avoidance and prohibitions, as we've seen at work in the formation of hysterical phobias, the rejection of the idea of an unconscious is, however, obstinately maintained, because it entails absenteeism from action, a motor fettering of the impulsion. Thus, in obsession neurosis, the work of repression is prolonged in a sterile and interminable struggle. So basically, the person who's hysterical, they just have an avoidance of something. Something drives them nuts, like a phobia for an animal, or their leg doesn't work or something like that, in which case there's no emotionality. So the phobia, any kind of phobia will be emotional, so it's fairly ineffective. Apparently, something like a somatic situation where they can't use a leg or something is very effective for dealing with the psychical content, but of course is very ineffective at life. And then the obsessional neurotic personality says it's an inner struggle. So instead of it being my leg doesn't work, or I'm scared of spiders or something, or small spaces or something like that, or going outside or whatever it is, instead they simply are very tight, uptight, have obsessive thoughts, because the obsessive thought, for example, behind this obsessive thought is that aggressive thought or sexual thought, and they have to keep getting rid of it, so they keep thinking over and over and over and over again. So, and of course, they are very emotionally repressed and sexually repressed, and it's very frustrating. What's kind of the difference between hysteria is more like you act out, whereas obsessional neurosis is more like it's an internal kind of deep, frustrating state of struggling. And it's extremely common, by the way. This short series of comparisons, so we're just finishing up here. The short series of comparisons presented here may easily convince us that more comprehensive investigations are necessary before we can hope thoroughly to understand the processes connected with repression and the formation of neurotic symptoms. The extraordinary intricacy of all the factors to be taken into consideration leaves us only one way of presenting them open to us. We must select first one and then another point of view and follow up through the material as long as the application of it seems to yield results. Each separate treatment of the subject will be incomplete in itself, and there cannot fail to be obscurities where it touches upon the material that has not yet been treated, but we may hope that a final synthesis will lead to a proper understanding. So he's basically saying it's very hard to understand these things, And usually what Freud will do is he'll talk about case stories, case histories, and they will look at case histories. And the idea is you have to look at each aspect of, how the person presents and what could be causing that, and hopefully if you revisit it many times, you'll get to a satisfying level. And of course, the reality is that it's not quite so simple. Freud produced various case histories. Many psychoanalysts have gone back and re-looked at them in different ways. And ultimately, from a clinical point of view, what matters is that you are living a happier life, and that's you might never get to find out exactly what happened. And it doesn't actually matter if you find out exactly what caused your problem. What really matters is you have an effective cure of it. As I think you can see by this chapter, there really is no way of getting outside of repression, because the only way to be outside of repression would be completely wild and animalistic. So every civilized human being has to have some degree of repression. But it should be repression to the degree that you can not be choked up and struggling with all sorts of negative thoughts and being upset, or you're having all sorts of hysterical symptoms. It should be effective enough that, you might repress the odd thing, but you can get on with your life, and you have a good shot at understanding your issues and so on and so forth. Personally, I find the subject of repression very interesting. I do think that you can criticize Freud for all sorts of things. I mean, the Oedipus complex is the one that's most open to debate because it sounds, extremely paternalistic. But repression, you can really see those repression, ideational and psychical thoughts being separated, symptoms, substitutes. You can see it very obvious. It's very obvious, and I think even people who are not into psychoanalysis, into other psychotherapies and so on, could easily see, we're basically trying not to deal with something that's terribly, something that's terribly unpleasurable, and we're trying to find a way at a subconscious level of dealing with it, or unconscious level of dealing with it, and it's not very effective. And that's the hysterical or neurotic symptoms are always about trying to deal with displeasure or unpleasure, and it's not very effective. And really, from a practical living point of view, what matters most is learning how to rejig things in your life so that maybe you're not, the Ubermensch or something, but that you're free of, you're not upset all the time at unpleasure. You're not like in a state of great anxiety or upsetness all your time. But the same token, you're quite effective. And that is the aim of all psychotherapy, is to become a happier, more functional version of yourself. So that's this speech there from 1915, I think it is, on repression. I think it's you could read it and think about it a lot. It's very, very interesting, and I still think by and large it's very relevant. One frustration I always had when reading Freud is, he's from an earlier part of the century, from the, a time where people tend to talk around things rather than just give notes. And we tend these days think, give me point 1A, 2A, 3A. We're very structured these days, which is a kind of modern thing, came in the last 50 years maybe. Before that, people were more kind of walking around the houses. There are advantages and disadvantages. The Freudian approach of kind of talking around in circles means that it's very hard to pin down exactly what he's talking about, and he throws a concept in and then he refers to it in another paper and so on, so it's quite frustrating at times. You can't just read one Freudian paper and understand it, and Freud kept on rejigging his ideas as well. So this is real old school, pre-World War II way of doing intellectual activity. But the good side of it is kind of like the difference between analog and digital. We want everything precise, and this kind of, I'm doing an essay, as it were, an essay on human nature, is you can throw concepts all over the place and explore things. So I think it's more imaginative and explorative, but if you're studying it, it is a bit of a challenge, because you're going to probably have to take a notebook out and start noting stuff down yourself. And if you just look at any kind of, notes on Freud that tend to be available, they tend to try and be structured, and you can't be fully structured with a guy like Freud. He will give you like a 10,000 word speech, for example, and come up with 27 different concepts, and you'll lose the gist if you just go by points. You got to try and get into thinking and put yourself into the situation that if you were in Victorian Austria, in Vienna, and you're dealing with all these repressed Victorian people, and you're a very curious and intellectual person, how are you going to deal with it? And that was his situation. And he was dealing with people who are probably far more repressed than we are, actually. And so he's the first guy to really do it in a very systematic format. So, yeah, a bit of a struggle when you're dealing with Freud. You have to go around the hills and valleys a bit. But I think there's some advantages to reading the original text. Back when I went to study psychoanalysis, I remember having an interview with the course director, and he says, you know, usually people learn Freud from a textbook, and the person who wrote the textbook read a textbook when they were in college, and that guy read a textbook. Nobody actually read the original reading. And so when you read it for yourself, you're going to have your own ideas and thoughts. And also remember that it is translated from German as well, so it's not fully accurate. And that's really, you have to read Freud. You can't just go by study notes on Freud. You have to read it yourself. And you'll see that there's a lot of subtlety and a lot of things which are not distinct, because we like everything to be distinct and, you know, discrete, like this, like that. And he's more like throwing ideas around the place. So that's my advice to you if you're studying Freud, is to read it and think about it and try and get the bigger picture, okay? Because he's coming from a time where people kind of talked around in circles, but also talking around in circles gives you a bigger scope and something to realize, there's some advantage, versus just having a user psychology book with a bunch of notes and you just mug up the notes. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. It is a fascinating paper and a seminal paper by Freud on the subject of repression, and hopefully it gives you some idea of the complexity of the subject of repression. Okay, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe. I'll talk to you next time.